Let's bring in MS Now's Vaughn Hilliard from the White House, MS Now's Inez de la Cuetara live from Davos, and MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode. Also with us, author of the Need to Know Substack and Daily Beast columnist David Rothkopf. Vaughn, President Trump really creating quite a stir and making some news there. Talk to us about how he tried to make the case for the U.S. to acquire Greenland.
Right, Anna. I think that we need to be very clear at this moment in time what the backdrop was to these remarks from the President of the United States in Switzerland. And that was that less than 24 hours ago, French President Emmanuel Macron, effectively speaking for a great number of European countries, was very explicit about the threat that the United States president was posing to European countries. He said yesterday, we're shifting to a world without rules. Imperial ambitions are resurfacing in which unacceptable tariffs are being used as leverage against territorial sovereignty, and that Trump wants to openly aim to weaken and subordinate Europe. That comes just days after President Trump threatened to impose new tariffs on each of those countries, including Europe and Denmark, I should say France and Denmark, unless they push for Denmark to agree to the selling of Greenland to the United States. And so while it is notable that President Trump there in Davos said that he does not intend to use force, he also made it very clear that it would be overwhelming force and that the U.S. could easily take it and that there would be little resistance. It was that sort of a threat that, of course, European allies, longtime European allies of the United States, are clearly in tune to, because President Trump has made his objective very clear. He has continued to post also about acquiring Canada. He has called himself the acting president of Venezuela. So his expansionist ideations have been made very clear to Europe. And the President of the United States made it clear that he and the United States effectively are boosting the economies of these European countries, and that if they were to forego cooperating with the United States, their economies would consequently suffer.
Inez, I'm curious if there's any international response so far to the Trump's remarks. I know it's early, but what is the tone? What are you hearing?
Yeah, and I will wait to get specific statements from different countries. But I think overall, there's a sense that the president's arguments are not holding up here. So he continues to insist that he needs Greenland for national security reasons. And yet it was just last week that the Danes and European allies announced they would be sending in reinforcements to Greenland, additional troops, additional resources to bolster security both in Greenland and around the Arctic. And the president's response was to threaten to slap 10% tariffs on those countries. So I think people don't understand what he's trying to do. Beyond that, you know, Anna, I was just in Greenland last week. We were talking about this. I repeatedly spoke to Greenlandic officials who told me there is no evidence of an immediate Russian threat from Russia or China, telling me that they had, not seen evidence of Russian and Chinese ships in Greenlandic waters, as the president has claimed. I even spoke to a Danish naval officer who told me that in his 30-plus years of, working in and around Greenland, he had never seen a Chinese or a Russian ship. So I think there's confusion in terms of, what the president's argument is here. People just don't understand what he's trying to do. And one more point I'll make, just, coming back from my trip from Greenland, speaking to people there, when you hear the president talking about how Greenland is just a piece of ice, that is something that's going to be deeply offensive to people there. Greenland is home to Greenlanders who are, the population there is a vast majority of them are Inuit. They are very proud. They have a very rich history and culture. It is much more than just a piece of ice to them. So that's something to watch, as well as the reaction coming from Greenlanders, Anna.
Yeah, Vaughn, you touched on some of the remarks we heard from world leaders ahead of the president's speech. In fact, it was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney who got a standing ovation when he talked about a rupture, not a transition underway, and also went on to say that there's a strong tendency for countries to sort of just go along, that it's the easier route to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety, he said. It won't. French President Macron also criticizing the president's take on Greenland and handling of allies. And the president called them out in his speech. What did he say directly about Mark Carney and Macron?
Right, Anna. Over the course of the last year, since the president's inauguration, we have seen a posture of appeasement by European countries largely towards President Trump. There have been agreements of trade deals that have been announced in order to try to bring down the temperature and take a certain level of tariff rate as opposed to exceedingly high tariff rates. And yet what we saw yesterday from President Macron of France and then Prime Minister Carney Carney of Canada was essentially calling on European allies of the United States to understand, in the words of Mark Carney, that there is a rupture of the world order and that this was not a slow transition, but this was happening at an accelerated rate. It was Carney that said there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. It won't. These threats to overtake Greenland and Canada have really spurred a response from the United States, some of their closest partners and allies. And then with the president going before this crowd in Davos, this is how he responded to the Canadian Prime Minister. Take a listen.
We're building a golden dome that's going to, just by its very nature, going to be defending Canada. Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
There was a bravado from the President of the United States there in Europe here today, in which he said the United States is keeping the whole world afloat. Not only was he saying that Canada couldn't live without the United States, he was standing there delivering the speech in Switzerland, and he referred to a conversation he said that he had last year with the female Prime Minister of Switzerland. We should be clear, there is no Prime Minister of Switzerland. There is a president of the Swiss Federation, in which he said very explicitly that talking about Switzerland, that, quote, they're only good because of us. And when he went back to World War II, he told that crowd that without us, you'd only be speaking German or a little Japanese, perhaps. The President of the United States very dismissive of the close partners and allies of the United States that have held this current global order really together, dating back to post-World War II construction.
You've called President Trump an idiot for his push to take control of Greenland, and you've said that Congress can't take any chances of allowing that to happen. You've met with the foreign ministers of both Denmark and Greenland this past week. How are they reacting to President Trump's threats?
Look, they're shocked, and they're trying to find reason within what's happening here. And I tried to explain to them there is no reasoning, right? The president just wants to have a legacy piece where he gets to claim that he brought in this big chunk of land that he sees on the map, even though it's, distorted map. And he's willing to ruin our whole foreign policy, all of our alliances, our economy, just so he could get what he wants. This man is doing everything for himself and nothing for us. Even the idea of buying it. We're going to spend billions and billions of dollars, potentially $500 billion, which is never going to happen. But right now we can't even afford health insurance for U.S. citizens, and we're talking about buying land. And let me just say one more time. Denmark, the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland has said, we will give you everything you want, short of giving you possession of our land. You want more bases, you get more bases. You want to put more people, you get it. The idea that we're going to waste money for everything we want is the dumbest decision we can make. The only person who can make a decision this dumb is someone that would actually let a casino go under. And guess who's president right now?
States Republican Mike Pence of Indiana. I see him wearing his Hoosier tie. I assume that that's a nod to Monday night's game. Mr. Vice President, we are seeing a lot
you better believe it.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of Republican pushback to the president's focus on Greenland and his threats yesterday to U.S. allies in terms of the tariffs. Republican Congressman Don Bacon told me yesterday in the wake of the president's new tariff threats, quote, I and most Americans disagree with the president's heavy-handedness. He is threatening NATO members, which is shameful, unquote. Are you concerned that these actions are jeopardizing the NATO alliance?
Well, I think it's a question right now, Jake, not of what the president's trying to accomplish, but how. And I have concerns about using what I think is a questionable constitutional authority, imposing unilateral tariffs on NATO allies to achieve this objective, as much as I had concerns about the threat of a military invasion, which apparently is no longer being talked about. But the what here, I think, is absolutely in the interest of the United States of America. I mean, literally, I think it was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State who negotiated the purchase of Alaska, who first suggested that the United States also purchase Greenland. I traveled to the region in 2019 visited Iceland to literally make the case of our national security interest as China and Russia continue to intrude farther and farther into the Arctic. So what the president's trying to do here, I think, is absolutely in the interest of the United States of America. I would just rather see the president use his persuasive powers and U.S. investment in Greenland to lay a foundation for ultimately achieving that goal.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Because just days ago, Donald Trump was talking like a man ready to redraw the world map, threatening tariffs, flexing power, and openly floating the idea of the United States acquiring Greenland. And now, suddenly a U-turn. Suddenly, everyone was happy. Suddenly, tariffs are off the table. So, the real question isn't what Trump said. The real question is what actually forced him to pull back. Because when a US president threatens allies, rattles NATO, and then reverses his course within days, that's not confidence. I think that's pressure. Okay, let's remind. Trump's Greenland push wasn't framed as a diplomacy, it was framed as leverage. First came the national security argument, then came the economic threat. Tariffs on Denmark, Europe, even Canada. And then came the implications that resistance would have consequences. At Davos, this wasn't subtle. The message was simple. America carries you, America funds you, America protects you. That's not partnership, that's hierarchy. Now, I think this is the point where things get uncomfortable for Trump. European leaders didn't just push back quietly, they pushed back publicly. French President Emmanuel Macron framed the moment as something bigger, a return of imperial thinking in a world that supposed moved past it. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney went even further, warning that going alone to get along doesn't but safety. That matters, because when allies stop trying to appease and start calling what they are, the power dynamic changes. And suddenly, Trump wasn't speaking to Europe, he was speaking against it. Now, here is the part I think that's quietly dismantled Trump's argument. Greenland itself, journalists on the ground reported something Trump kept insisting didn't exist. There was no evidence of immediate Russian or Chinese military threats in Greenland water. And Greenlandic officials were blunt. They are open to cooperation, bases for resources, but the only thing is just not ownership. This matters because President Donald Trump's forming reduced Greenland to a strategic object, a piece of ice. But Greenland is an empty territory. It's a place with people, culture, sovereignty, something Trump's language ignored. And that tone, it didn't just offended Greenland, it alarmed allies. For me, I think this is the point that stopped story being Trump versus Europe and being Trump versus reality. Senator Ruben Clego didn't just criticize the plan, he questioned the motive. What is the motive behind this? Why Trump argue Greenland? His argument was simple. This wasn't about security, it was about legacy. A symbolic land grab, a headline, maybe a trophy, and then came back Republican discomfort. Even figures inside Trump's own political orbit started raising alarms, especially about using tariffs against NATO allies. Former Vice President Mike Pence frames it carefully. Supporting US interests in the architect, yes. Using economic coercion and constitutional gray zones, not so much. That distinction is, I think, critical because it shows the issue wasn't Greenland itself, it was how Donald Trump tried to get there. After all that, Trump's walk back the tariff threats, claimed productive talks with NATO, says everyone was happy. But I think this is not the reality. Nothing structural changed. No deal was announced. No sovereignty was shifted. So what changed was resistance. I think political resistance, European resistance, diplomatic resistance, and the most important is public resistance. And President Donald Trump, who thrives on dominance, faced something he doesn't handle well. So all the collective reason is just the cause to stop the story between Trump versus Greenland. And I think this wasn't about Greenland. It was about whether modern allies still operate on rules or whether power alone decided outcomes. Trump tested the system. The system pushed back. And for once, it pushed back loudly enough that even Trump had to step off the accelerator. So that's not weakness, that's friction. That's force which compelled President Donald Trump to stop these kind of things. At the end, so the Greenland episode, I think, isn't over. But what we just witnessed wasn't negotiation, it was a stress test. And for the first time in a while, Trump did not fully control the result. Thank you so much for watching. So please subscribe, the bell icon button, and hit the like button for next more videos.